Right, well, as Andrew said, I was extremely grateful to have benefited from Roger's generosity for the early stages of my research when I was doing lots of travelling to record offices and obtaining primary sources. So in the paper, I looked at two main lines of inquiry in relation to smallpox in the 18th century. Firstly, levels of inoculation practice in the Oxfordshire region, and secondly, the nature of familial transmission of the disease. The second stream has been made possible with the use of Campox family reconstitution data, parish burial registers, and other primary and secondary sources. The first section examines families' perceptions of smallpox inoculation. As I looked at private letters and memoirs, especially from parents concerning their children, one point became particularly clear. Inoculation was a valued tool in helping families pass safely through smallpox, as a person's response to inoculation appeared to be far less severe than experiencing the disease naturally. The inoculated person was believed to be immune from the disease the rest of their lives. However, the topic often brought families into conflict, as shown in some of the examples in my paper. In my examples, those of a less liberal attitude, and I have to say mainly the older generation in my cases, found it challenging to accept placing their precious young families at risk. As part of my research, I decided to look more closely at the role of the inoculation practitioner. Taking Oxfordshire and its contiguous counties, I addressed certain questions. How prevalent were practitioners in the region? How do they operate? And do their writings help to provide us with detail which we could draw upon? Frustratingly, I only found one practitioner's diary and even fewer life writings from Oxfordshire in particular. But I did find some detailed correspondence from families in Gloucestershire and Norfolk. Therefore, I conducted a trawl of all the advertisements and articles in the local weekly newspaper, the Jackson's Oxford Journal, from its inauguration in 1753 until the end of the century. I've summarised the results of the trawl in the points below. The practice was lucrative. Inoculation was a lucrative business for the practitioner, either when carried out peripatetically or as a sideline to other areas of practice. I saw several examples of practitioners fitting out new premises and purchasing materials, in other words, investing monies into their businesses, after a round of treating patients in a particular area. They were also well organised. Practitioners recruited potential patients, often in public houses, after advertising their intended presence in the local newspaper. Sometimes they offered preparation medicines in advance of the procedure. They were flexible, they understood the market, and they tailored their prices to suit the pocket of the consumer. They often worked out of specially purchased or rented inoculation houses, or in people's own homes through group sessions. Here, the parishioners themselves would organise minimum groups of people for inoculation. Sometimes tempting incentives were offered to attract the customer, usually at an extra cost, such as sugar, coffee, and occasionally chocolate. Inoculators had good working relationships with authorities, provided they kept to the rules laid down by the parishes concerned. However, they rarely enjoyed peace and harmony with each other, unless they were working in partnership. Competition was fierce, often accompanied by aggressive interprofessional rivalry. One would accuse another of killing a patient, or of offering a substandard service in some way, or of trying to set up a house too near to where locals were likely to roam. It was also a demand-led provision. Inoculators were often called upon to a parish if a smallpox outbreak was threatened or present. Prices were high, reaching a peak in the 1760s when the number of practitioners flourished to meet demand. Demand appeared to outstrip supply, pushing up prices. Now this slide shows the number of individually named inoculators against the level of advertisements in the journal between 1760 and 1799. The dotted line represents the number of advertisements, reaching nearly 100 in 1768, and the solid line below, the number of individual practitioners, although some inoculated again and again, but these are the number of individual ones, just below 30 in this particular year. You'll see that as more practitioners entered the market in the 1760s, advertising became more intense. So that's inoculation for the time being, but we will return to it later. Part 2 of the paper investigates transmission pathways of smallpox. This slide shows the breakdown of smallpox deaths during 3 severe epidemics in the early 18th century. And this was before inoculation was used, all these 3. There's no evidence of the practice in Banbury, for example, until 1760. So here we have Banbury 1718-19, Banbury again 1731-33, and Ainhoe in Northamptonshire 1723-24. Now for the first slide, the first box, the first epidemic in Banbury, children comprised the largest group, adding to their general findings on their susceptibility. Banbury 1731-33, again, children comprised the largest group. However, here, some 12 years later, the proportion of adult deaths was lower. Men particularly, and that's the green wedge, were less fatally affected, most likely due to immunity for some of them gained from the previous outbreak. Now we've got Ainhoe 1723-24. Here smallpox was less fatal for children than for adults. We don't know why this was. Perhaps it reflects high levels of vulnerable adults in the community. In other words, they were experiencing the penalty for avoiding the disease in childhood, or there were just fewer children in the community. We do know that sufferers in Ainhoe were nursed and carefully monitored by nurses individually, probably in a pest house. I'll just let you read that for a second before I just go on. This slide is a summary and a resume of my paper, of my findings on the transmission of the disease in families and communities in Banbury and Ainhoe. Prior immunity of parents in Banbury appears to be a significant factor. When I looked closely at infant smallpox deaths, particularly in the second outbreak, I found that the proportion of these deaths in migrant families was higher than that in the non-migrant group. And I defined in-migrant families as those not in observation in family reconstitution data before or during the first epidemic. Common to both Banbury outbreaks, I saw that in cases of parental and child smallpox deaths in the same family, mercifully there weren't too many of those, but there were some, the majority of young children died after a parent, or were buried after a parent, and people were buried quite soon after death in the case of smallpox. In the cases of very young children, there may be a relationship between this and the loss of breastfeeding mothers, although in these few cases the children were yet reported of dying of the disease itself and no other cause. However, there were few combinations of mothers and their own infants losing their lives, and none at all in the second outbreak. So there's not enough evidence here to be able to say more. There was little risk of elevated mortality in children if a parent in their family died, and no difference in risk of death to children, no matter which parent it was. In other words, children of mothers who died did not appear to be more vulnerable than those of fathers. It's surprising, perhaps, that transmission from parents to children did not affect more mothers and children. And there was no correlation between the size of the family, in other words, the number of children, and the number of child smallpox deaths in a family. And taking both family outbreaks, there was only one case of both parents dying. The points above possibly suggest good isolation practices when a family member was ill, joint parenting, and possibly a use of caring substitutes when mothers were ill. However, common to all three epidemics, that's the two in Banbury and the one in Ainhoe, the under 5-year age groups commonly died after the first chronological stage of each epidemic. And this is particularly striking in the second Banbury outbreak. Only 1 out of 22 in the under 5 age group smallpox deaths occurred in the first 5 months of the outbreak, with 92% of infant smallpox deaths occurring in the final 8 months of the 23-month epidemic, the second one. And no infants died at all in Ainhoe. So, just to conclude, the late 1760s saw peak inoculation activity in Oxfordshire and its surrounding counties, indicating peak inoculation rates, and all ages were treated. There's a little bit more about that in my paper. There was an absence of severe smallpox epidemics in Oxfordshire after the 1760s, and that was the time when inoculation was widespread in the area. Another point here, and actually this is not in the paper, in Oxfordshire, children fared better than adults in the second half of the century. After the 1760s, the number of child smallpox deaths fell considerably, and by the last decade, very few smallpox deaths were recorded, and those were almost all of adults. Inoculation programs were likely to be a factor here. Prior immunity was a key element in shaping the prevalence of the disease. Parents and, of course, older siblings appear to be key vectors in the familial transmission. And I would say here that young children were most at risk from within the home environment. And finally, children and young people inoculated in the late 1760s, which was the heyday of the practice, were often the parents of the next generation of children. And as protected, or in other words, inoculated adults, they provided safer home environments for their children. And my question is, did this affect smallpox and infant mortality? Thank you.